Nintendo's third quarter financial results covering the period up to the end of December 2025 have now been released. Despite this being a quieter one compared to their half-yearly and year-end updates, this does have some quite big details, including Switch topping DS in sales, good news for Donkey Kong and Kirby fans, rather dubious numbers for Metroid Prime 4 and Galaxy, in fact no numbers at all for Metroid Prime 4, and lots more interesting stuff. So let's explore. So firstly, we have the consolidated financial highlights expressed both in yen terms and in a percentage change from previously. Note here that although the sales and therefore the profits are up, because the margins on the new console are less and the upfront costs of launch are greater, the net profit ratio is down, but it must be said that 15.8% is still relatively high for Nintendo historically, and reflects the continued sell-through of original Switch titles and even systems, where Nintendo had already paid the majority of the costs, and so essentially all the profit is just gravy, plus to some degree the continued weakness of the yen against the other currencies. Comparing with the previous results, it seems Nintendo put on about 800 billion yen in net sales during the holiday quarter compared to 400 billion yen last year. Across the 3 quarters, this averages out to a 99% increase in sales, although sales were relatively low in holiday 2024, but of course they did have a few considerable wins back then, such as the launch of Super Mario Party Jamboree. Okay, in terms of consolidated sales, you can see some specific segmentations, and the platform business is doing even better, whereas income from movies, videos, and merchandise is actually down. In a previous investor report, they attributed this to the gradual waning effect of the Mario movie effect on sales, and it's the same here, according to Furukawa's notes. Last year also had a couple of features like the Animal Crossing Pocket Camp for Purchase Edition launching and Alamo, although I can't imagine that moved the needle too perceptibly. The pie chart in the corner gives us the spread of sales, and it suggests that over the holiday season the American and European slices of the pie have expanded by a couple of percent, while Japan and others have slightly contracted. The effect of the exchange rate is much lower than the last quarter because the yen progressively weakened against the dollar over the course of the quarter. I'm not quite sure what their base rate is for the assumption that 7.5 billion yen were lost in exchange rate trading, but I assume it's last year's equivalent quarter where the yen was also in a real low against the dollar, so this figure looks a lot worse than, frankly, I think it probably is for them. Okay, here's a really fun one. Game sales. 14 million Mario Kart Worlds is a crazy number, but we knew with the pack-ins it would track the Switch 2 to a huge degree. I really think we're just at the beginning of what Nintendo are going to be doing with Mario Kart World, since they can always move the needle for most of their install base in just one swing by adding to it or adapting it for years to come. But I must admit, the one that really makes my heart sing is Donkey Kong Bonanza at 4.2 million. I've covered before that Donkey Kong's numbers have never been all that bad, but it's been a long time since its numbers have really wowed. For comparison, at the end of March 2018, i.e. after 5.5 months on the market, just like Bonanza at the end of this accounting period, Super Mario Odyssey had sold 10.41 million units. Of course, the key thing is whether Bonanza can become an evergreen in the same way. Odyssey ultimately nearly tripled these numbers over the course of the console's lifespan, and if Bonanza can do the same, it would pass the 10 million threshold that would probably see it fall out of the top 10 Switch 2 games in time, but would still be the kind of standing that Luigi's Mansion 3 and Splatoon 2 had on the Switch, i.e. a very satisfactory seller indeed. Not mentioned in this whole document is Metroid Prime 4, and the only reasonable assumption here is that it didn't clear a million sales in its first 4 weeks. Now, that's not the end of the world given how late in the calendar year it released, and I'm sure it will have done so by the March data, but it's still a little sad given that this would obviously have been a sign of a more sure-footed start than Prime games usually have had historically. Obviously, some purists will say that the title should suffer for its perceived crimes, and perhaps that may be the case, but frankly I don't think Nintendo will interpret weaker sales as anything other than a mark against the Prime version of the franchise going forward, and so I just don't think it's a good thing for anyone that the Prime sales are down. The Switch sales are also down 66%. I've looked before at the drop-off in late-in-life consoles, and a two-thirds drop-off around the launch of new hardware seems fairly standard, but all credit to Nintendo that the software sales have barely gone down at all. As for Switch 2, 17.37 million units seems a very healthy haul to me at not quite the 7-month mark, and it means that it seems now quite possible that Nintendo could hit the 20 million mark in the financial year, something that even before the price was revealed, I felt might be quite tricky for them. I was thinking more in the 17 to 18 million category, albeit at that point because I also expected a high price, which we then got. I suspect this may be why they decided that they didn't need to juice the January to March quarter with, so far, too much in the way of major releases. If Tomodachi is ready for April, I am sure they could have put it in March, but assuming that they have a consistent and fairly predictable manufacturing output, they may have felt that a small accumulation of consoles in February would help them to accommodate what they hope will be demand spikes during the movie release in the West and over Golden Week, especially after the release of Tomodachi Life in Japan, although of course that title is curiously focused on Switch 1, despite Koizumi almost grudgingly mentioning it in the Direct recently that it's Switch 2 compatible. I am a little surprised that at the moment they are not advertising a Switch 2 edition, but I suppose it also does give them a way to reinvent the game later on, and so if after a couple of years they put out a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, they effectively get to advertise it as new. Digital sales then, and as always, the digital proportion does drop over Christmas. It's a weird quirk of the way that Nintendo reports these, that the digital sales always look stronger during the August and November reports because these don't incorporate the holiday season into their numbers. All the same, the percentage of digital is slightly up over last year, something Furukawa in his notes attributes to more digital downloads, which makes sense with all the Nintendo Switch 2 editions. Is this also a sign of people avoiding game keycards? Well, given the large number of Switch 1 games being sold, I rather suspect that it's not a huge difference out of the total proportion. Gross profit also has a metric which suggests that the proportion of digital sales was actually down subtly, presumably reflecting that even if sales were up, it's for fewer higher ticket products, as well as, of course, the Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades. Selling, general and administrative expenses and operating costs is all up as you'd expect. Advertising expenses are naturally up significantly, but note also that R&D continues its inexorable upward trajectory over the recent years. As well as planning for mid-gen consoles or new game and theme park developments, Nintendo must know that they have the window of success of the Switch 2, probably 5 and in the most optimistic estimation 10 years, to safeguard them against people starting to become bored with the Switch systems and therefore to have a worthy successor in place. I think over time this will become a far more pressing concern for Nintendo, even if at the moment they can rest assured that they have several years of comfort before it's a consideration. Now, under ordinary and net profit, we see that the exchange rate was much more positive on New Year's Eve 2025 than a year prior. But of course, Nintendo's exchange rate calculations earlier reflected the whole quarter, where things were a little more turbulent. Still, the foreign exchange gains are up massively as a percentage, partly because they just had far more income to start with from selling bigger ticket items. The company remains on a historic lucky streak in the 2020s with regard to the exchange rates, and that shows no sign of changing imminently. In Furukawa's notes, he also explains that the sale of long-term securities helped their profits. Evidently, Nintendo had been heavily hedging to ensure that they could weather a variety of tricky circumstances during the Switch 2 launch, but since that went relatively smoothly, they are now in a fairly benign position. Their forecasts put their profits and therefore their dividends as being up. Of course, by changing the basis of how they determine their dividends recently, it will be up probably come what may because they are using a more generous measure. They are sticking with 19 million units sold, which I think may be a bit of an eyebrow raiser for the investors. This means less than 2 million units of Switch 2 are expected to be sold in the January to March quarter. I mean, it's far from impossible given that the only significant Switch 2 exclusives we have for the period so far are Mario Tennis Fever and Pocopia, both of which should be relatively major titles, but probably aren't major day one sales drivers. This quarter is always a bit of a lull, but still, I'd anticipate Nintendo surpassing their forecast even if they don't quite scrape 20 million. Now on this slide you can also see the power of the Switch install base. 155 million units of software sold last year is crazy, and the Switch 2 is still a long way from that despite an incredibly strong start, but for now the combined software sales of the two systems is over the figure from last year, which is a pretty good place to be in. Furukawa doesn't directly address the hardware sales change, but does address the profitability forecasts remaining stable. Let's read and then unpick. He says, based on sales performance for the third quarter and the outlook going forward, the breakdown of unit sales by region and by product have shifted somewhat from earlier expectations. Specifically, the proportion of hardware sales in Japan has increased, and for software, the proportion of units sold in Japan and the composition of titles from other software publishers have risen. These changes are expected to be a factor reducing operating profit. Therefore, after considering both the positive effects of the revised exchange rate assumptions and negative effects of the changes in the regional and product mix of unit sales, we have determined that the overall changes in net sales and profit levels did not require a revision. Accordingly, we have maintained our financial forecast. End quote. Now, the proportion of units in Japan being up is a nice framing for other markets being significantly down, it seems to me, which does correlate with the trends Sakana and others were identifying, and of course, without the exchange rate fillip, Japanese sales might not be making Nintendo quite as much. I think this is a sensible and cautious move not to make any changes, but he is open to questions from investors about why he's not being more aggressive about pushing Switch 2 to sell more in only its third full quarter on the market after all. In reality, I think 20 million is a psychological barrier, and so even if they came in with 19.999 million units at the end of year results, it will be framed as a failure if they had predicted 20 million, and so I can understand why he is sticking with 19. I'd be surprised though if they didn't clear 19 million by the end of March, and I think there's a pretty decent chance that they'll clear 20 as well. Okay, let's move on to what Nintendo identify as their business highlights for the year. They reached 15 million units sold in late December 2025 for the Switch 2, and as they note, Switch 2 is the fastest selling platform Nintendo has ever released, and by a significant margin at that. Now, I find it a bit weird that they've phrased it as late December 2025, since the 17 million units they claim to have sold in this period is well above 15, and so this feels like it's more for mood music than strict accuracy, the kind of graph that Nintendo do sometimes put out just to give a flavour of where they're going, rather than to necessarily have hard granular data. By comparison, the original Switch didn't hit a holiday season until a bit later, and it had supply constraints out of the gate and for a good chunk of its early months. Switch 2 has had a few issues in Japan, but generally the supply has held up considerably. Still, even going close to the 1 year mark, we can see that early Switch didn't match Switch 2 and reach 50 million over this extended period. Now, this of course has all kinds of implications. If they feel they've captured the early adopter market expeditiously, they might want to bring forward other iterations of the technology, but equally, they may see this as a good opportunity to try to expand the base ownership of Switch 2 before juicing it through other means. In his notes, Furukawa uses classic Japanese understatement, saying, "We believe we have been able to get off to a good start." We also have the obligatory boast that Nintendo has finally beaten its own record with the Nintendo DS. With Sony vaguing up the numbers of PlayStation 2 sold to roughly 160 million, and Switch probably unlikely to decisively clear that figure, I rather doubt that Nintendo will ever do a console comparison to Sony, although if they find some way to push the Switch beyond its standard life, releasing an ultra-low cost variant or something like that, it may still be possible. I certainly think 160 million units remains conceivable, but it does look unlikely. The 3DS lost about two-thirds of its purchases a year in the later days, and that had a later in-life push with the launch of the new 2DS XL. The 66% drop-off for Switch seems to track that general trajectory. Still, game share is something that Nintendo are focusing on a lot, and it could be a good budget option for families who want children to be able to play Switch 2 together. Also, Tomodachi Life was a huge hit on the 3DS, and so it's quite possible that it will be a significant seller for the Switch as well. A few years of sales dipping by two-thirds each time, though, would probably leave Switch 2 around the 158 million mark, which is kind of at the moment where I expect it to end up. It's also especially impressive that their annual playing base of users has barely dropped off at all, and especially since most of them won't have been on the new hardware yet. Furukawa notes, with our dedicated video game platforms prior to Nintendo Switch, our relationship with consumers was interrupted whenever they purchased a new platform which presented challenges. In contrast, the Nintendo Switch install base, which is our largest ever, and the fact that many consumers continue to play on the platform provide a strong business foundation that has supported the launch of Nintendo Switch 2. All the more reasons why I expect they'll continue to try to go with the Switch ecosystem for a long time if they can possibly help it. Here then we have a software rundown, and it's interesting to note how they continue to track Nintendo Switch 2 editions and new games at pretty much a one-to-one rate. Will that stop in the new financial year as they've now cleared most of their biggest Switch games and will need to start to focus on Switch 2 exclusives? Well, I think as the install base increases, there's definitely potential for some of the smaller selling titles to receive upgrades as well. I suspect this may be the reason that they're waiting on the Xenoblade games especially, and I remain confident that in the very long term we will see expansions of games like Luigi's Mansion 3 and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, although if new games in these franchises are imminent, then they may of course save these for later in the console's lifespan. I do think Nintendo Switch 2 editions will eventually fall to being a lower part of the overall mix of games, but just as Nintendo have continued to release remasters of old Wii U and other titles through the Switch era, even as far as Xenoblade Chronicles X releasing in 2025, I could certainly see them continuing to have Nintendo Switch 2 editions well into the Switch 2's dotage. New games planned for release are shown here then. Furukawa comments, by preparing a diverse lineup including additional games like Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave and Splatoon Raiders that take advantage of the performance and new features of Nintendo Switch 2, we are further accelerating the momentum of the platform. Now, I think it's a pity they don't have a decent cover art yet for Fortune's Weave, but I guess that will come. January was unusually slow, but perhaps they just felt that Animal Crossing New Horizons was such a big game that it could hold its own. It is, after all, the second biggest seller on the Nintendo Switch, and not all that far behind Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, although that is well out of the lead. From February, though, we're on a classic 3-weekly schedule of releases, and that includes Tomodachi Life on the 16th of April. I was genuinely really surprised by this choice of date. Of course, I did expect it to come in this broader period, but not specifically at the earlier part of April. April has been a real dead month for Nintendo game releases for a very long time. Labo VR released in mid-April in 2019, and I think Advance Wars 1 Plus 2 Reboot Camp came on the 21st of April in 2023, and that was relatively early, but of course that had been rescheduled a couple of times before. However, almost without exception, Nintendo ramp up their year, starting with the last week in April or even the beginning of May. So this suggests a plan for a far more dense next quarter than we've possibly been expecting so far, which is exciting. Also note that Pokémon Champions has apparently been confirmed to be playable at an event in August, which suggests that it's likely to release beforehand, which also would keep it clear of the inevitable big new Christmas game. Then there's a good selection of third-party titles listed. I barely have the time to play first-party games these days, let alone third-party ones, but it seems like a really solid lineup to me, and Elliot and Layton look pretty cool down there as well. There's a quieter than normal showing on the broader IP front, partly because the half-yearly and annual reports are usually the times when they go to town far more on IP news, and partly because the quarter is simply quieter because of broader initiatives not being necessary while they're focusing on selling the big holiday games. Still, we have the new Fukuoka store, which looks great. Incidentally, I wonder how long it will be before we get an update of the Legend of Zelda designs used in the stores. They obviously haven't wanted to update Link to the Breath of the Wild version, that's fair as the Twilight Princess model is iconic, but if and when a new game is revealed, they may want to do so. It occurs to me that having a consistent branding for Link with an updated character model for the next generation may be a good reason for a more substantial game reveal ahead of the 2027 movie, even if it's just in the form of the kind of teaser that they did in 2019 for the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Then again, Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Mario Kart World both updated Mario's look, and the latter changed Donkey Kong's look substantially, and this scheduling wasn't affected by the character's cinematic antics, so it probably won't make too much of a difference. Furukawa notes in his additional comments, Furthermore, in the Kyushu region, we are collaborating with JR Kyushu Railway Company to launch a campaign called Super Mario times JR Kyushu, Let's Go Kyushu. Sure, this isn't that significant, but it's a reminder of how important Nintendo is to Japan to drive tourism, and that special place of responsibility may also explain some of Nintendo's more cautious decisions. Okay, speaking of the movies previously, well, that's just a really cool poster, I think. Then we have the 40th anniversary initiatives listed, and perhaps the most curious in certain respects is Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. I mean, it is a game that's coming out soon, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that it's there, especially after it was listed as part of the 40th in the Direct in September. But since it's coming out in the spring, it suggests that they're wanting to keep the anniversary period going for a fair time after the movie releases, or at least that Yoshi won't release very far into the next quarter. It's still possible, of course, that they could drop it a bit sooner, but I think the time window for a March release is pretty tight, especially given how dense the March window already is with Pocopia and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. From the 3 weekly selling cycles, 14th of May now seems like the likeliest bet to me. Obviously, a big one here is selling the Galaxy games, and I think this remains the biggest reason why they may hold fire on announcing a 3D Mario yet, even though I remain of the belief that there will be one. If it's even slightly Galaxy themed, they won't want the clash, and remember, the game would have been deep in development by the time they gave Illumination the green light to send to the next movie on Galaxy, so I do think some synchronicity can be expected, given what a powerful advertising tool the movies are. Having said that, as we'll get to, the Galaxy games have not sold, as far as I can see, enormously well for them. Of course, if you take the view that the fall-off in Nintendo's stock price recently is a concern, something that I think is far from catastrophic, but I have covered in other videos, well, in that case, if they want to address it, perhaps some kind of oblique teaser would do the job in a February Direct, if it's something they can shove out as a movie trailer as well. I don't know whether they'll want to do a full reveal of the next 3D Mario, but it's something where they could want to begin the warm-up marketing. Still, I tend to maintain that they probably won't move on something new until the 40th anniversary has fully cleared, although I think, given the current overall circumstances, is a much murkier picture than I would have said back in September. Okay, let's get into the actual numbers. Notable here is the potential for IP and merchandising to expand into Europe and the rest of the world, something that I expect will be a low-key priority for Nintendo and probably a more major consideration for Nintendo of Europe going forward. With so many different countries and languages, and with some areas of Europe having different histories with Nintendo prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europe represents a bigger challenge for Nintendo, but it's obviously a market with significant potential for them, and it's probably less expensive to try to push into Europe more than it might be to tackle whole new markets where they haven't entered previously. There are more specifics on sales in different currencies in this section, and these are largely as we have seen previously. Digital sales we've discussed before as well. There is a slight long-term trend towards digital, but note that Q1 of this financial year and the last financial year are almost identical for our digital sales. The divergence seems to come with Switch 2 and of course with those Nintendo Switch 2 editions. The proportion of first-party sales always seems to rise in the holiday quarter, but of course that's also when Nintendo release a ton of their biggest titles, so I don't think that's too significant. Still, let's get on to Switch 2's sales breakdown. Okay, so far it's sold 17 million. Remember, they use units of 10,000, so it comes out as 1,737 units, but it's 17 million. What I do notice is that proportionate to the sales so far, the forecast for software is far more ambitious than the forecast for consoles. In consoles, they expect to sell another 1.6 million or so, whereas for games, they expect to basically match the pace of the financial year so far, even when that year includes a holiday season and a new console launch. Now, that said, they may be spot on because of Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Animal Crossing New Horizons being such reliable evergreen sellers. Will New Horizon, Pocopia, Tennis Fever, and Wonder collectively drive millions in sales? Very possibly, with Pocopia especially feeling like a bit of a dark horse. But it's still interesting to me that they have a relatively high expectation for sales in this quarter. As for the classic Switch, the one I find curious here is actually the Lite. Despite being the value option, it remains lower selling, especially in the other territories, where the differential is far starker than in Japan and America. It seems that the Lite was created as a successor to the 3DS, with the 3DS having had its last new game in March 2019 and the Lite announced that summer for a September release. But if the objective is a budget option for Switch 2, perhaps there are other ways Nintendo could work it this time, although I might cycle back to that in another video. Here's the big one, the million-seller first-party titles. Pokemon Legends Split is interesting and suggests that the Pokemon Company can quite confidently put out the next game as a Switch 2 exclusive, given what a big proportion of their install base, nearly a third, were on Switch 2 by the end of this December. And that's probably an underestimate, since I guess many people might have bought the game for Switch in October and upgraded later if they were fortunate enough to have a Switch 2 under the Christmas tree. I'm really pleased to see Kirby Air Ride has made a big splash as well. 1.76 million might not seem too huge by the numbers we're used to seeing, but proportionate to the Switch's install base, it's a pretty big deal, especially since it released quite far into the quarter. What I am really surprised by, though, is the sales of Super Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2. That Galaxy's sales are quite low isn't too astonishing, of course, because it was already on the 35th anniversary pack, but Galaxy 2 is a major re-release of a game that never had the kind of reach of its predecessor. For it to scoop only 2.42 million, barely more than the decade-old Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, is surprising to me. The 3D All-Stars collection 5 years ago had a bigger install base and launched during the pandemic period, but still nearly sold out its limited 10 million run quite quickly. I wonder if they will regret doing the Galaxy games as a double pack, or at least having put Galaxy on the All-Stars collection previously, rather than keeping their powder dry. For a long time I mooted the prospect of a Plus game add-on, Galaxy 2 plus Bowser's Nebula, and I suspect that this might have moved the needle far more. Is the reason for the dip the fact that it was presented as an original Switch title? A lot of late-in-life 3DS games also seem to suffer from people being ready for new hardware. Or is this just Galaxy fatigue after 2020? It's hard to say. On the other hand, the title is bound to sell a lot around the movie, so I would guess in the long term it will probably end up being a good deal for them, and while Nintendo Software Technology obviously put a fair amount of effort and time into the game, the bones of the titles are over a decade old, and so I'm sure in profitability terms the games will be a win. So apart from this, the Switch list is pretty much a survey of the evergreens. The rest of the document is basically reiterating prior information in a handy place for investors who may not assiduously track every Nintendo Today announcement. I hadn't actually kept track that there was another Hello Mario launch this February, I must admit, but I guess they will highlight it on Mario Day, so even for me, this was a useful refresher. There will probably be a Q&A in due course. I usually wait for the official translations, which may be a few days away, and it depends on my work schedule and when Nintendo drop it as to when I can get to it, but I will try to do that in the next week or so. As ever, do check out the Patreon to support the channel. It's really appreciated. And of course, thank you so much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.